After Christ, whether you're Christian, Jew, or Muslim, and also even for philosophy, you are defining yourself in relation to Christ.
Whether you're logos or synagogue,
because Christ is the synagogue of Satan is anti-logos.
Turning away from it, yeah.
It's turning away from Christ. Do you have vinegar and oil? I'll have that, please. Right? So the synagogue of Satan is the rejection of logos. And if you think about it, modern philosophy, going back to 1410, it seems to always the Hussite Revolution. But I think the Hussite Revolution is the revolution that enables, in many ways, modern, and it enables modern philosophy to. I'm more and more convinced that modern philosophy is the fruit of a religious choice. It's not the other way around. In other words, for those of you who were in my class that read Maritain, I think Maritain is right in Three Reformers. That it's the Hussite Revolution and then Lutheranism that make Descartes possible. It's not Descartes that makes Lutheranism possible. So modern philosophy itself is a religious choice.
So would you say then that the modern philosophers actually believed in God, or they just used God as a way of actually getting at their philosophical ideas through the filters?
I think modern philosophers in some sense are rejecting the fullness of Christ. And then philosophy becomes the attempt to understand being without reference to Christ. And at that point,
it's a contradiction.
At that point, see that because in some sense Christ basically says, Plato and Aristotle, the height of the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle is openness to being. That's where they can get us to being. But Christ says, I am being. So if you philosophers are going to understand reality, you have to understand me. And I think Christ then the fullness of Christ is the church. And the church over the course of 400 years, 500 years, over the course of 1,200 years, it starts to convert people one by one. And then also, once you have the mass conversions, you get a culture that is a Christian culture. There are flaws in it. It's not freaking utopia, right? There are flaws in it, but it's essentially a Christian culture. Slavery disappears. Unjust economic exploitation disappears. Genocidal warfare disappears. And beginning I think with Occam in philosophy, but also beginning I think especially with you start to see it in the Albigensians in the 10th and 11th centuries. An attempt by some people to be religious, but to reject the moral life of Christ. Some aspect of the moral life of Christ. And they reject the church as a result of that. This movement that begins with the Albigensians in the 10th and 11th centuries, it never becomes a sustained political and cultural and economic movement until the Hussite Revolution in the Czech Republic, which begins in 1410. That only sustains itself for a generation or two, and it kind of peters out. But in some ways, to this day, the Czech Republic is a complicated place because of the Hussite Revolution. And the Hussites reject Christ in the end. They reject they don't, see, this is the thing. In many ways, the Hussite Revolution and then the Protestant Revolution after that, they're ways of wearing the mask of religion to reject the fullness of Christianity. But the Hussite Revolution sets the pattern of what will happen in all following Christian revolutions. But the point is that I think in the Hussite Revolution, with Luther, you get a rejection of Christ, because you get a rejection of the church, and you get a rejection of some. I think in the end, what the rejection is, it's just, they're scandalized at some aspect of the moral life of certain Catholics, and that leads them to reject the moral life of Christ, the fullness of the moral life of Christ. And then they end up, then they steal the land of the church, and in stealing the land of the church, that becomes the basis of modern capitalism. And every capitalism develops in the modern Could I have some silverware? And then, did you put vinegar and oil on it? Okay, thanks. So, I just asked. That was polite, wasn't it?
He's being recorded. We can go back and review it tomorrow or Wednesday.
Yeah, we can send it to Miss Manners. It's being recorded, so we can send it to Miss Manners for review.
Good question. Oh, in the little break period while we're eating for a second, I have a comment.
Okay, go.
I was in Borders the other day. It's really not related at all. It has to do with these revolutionary attitudes that we've now gotten to in capitalism.
Yeah?
Is it like small bookstores that become large bookstore chains?
Yeah.
And like Borders now?
Ridiculous.
I went into the bathroom at Borders, and there was a book in the stall. It was homosexual photography.
Yeah.
You look at it?
And it didn't have any like price tags or anything on it. It was just like, I almost feel like the store put it there. So, like, what is the natural conclusion?
Wouldn't surprise me.
Capitalism is this like pleasure seeking that's completely crazy. But no, like, I remember we talked about that once. It's this capitalism all automatically unravels into this like
Thank you.
completely disordered ridiculousness. But no, that's what I thought of because I was just in this. I hate to say that finding something like that in the bathroom reminded me of you, but
well
in
done,
the most intellectual sort of way, I was like, you know what? Professor Langan did warn us of the dangers of these big chains.
The thing is, it's not just the dangers of the big chains. It's also the dangers of. I think Plato's right about this. Every institution is a reflection of the soul of the people who run the institution, and so it's not. It's the thing is that in all the countries where capitalism arises, the people will use religion as a kind of mask for rationalizing giving in to the desire for wealth.
Wasn't there a book that called Jesus is the Great Salesman, something like that?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, America is fraught with it right now.
What do you think TBN is? Send us your love gift and we'll send you a CD and Turner Broadcasting Network. Holy rollers, wave a hand in your face and you're healed.
So in the first generation, the people will they'll be religious and they'll follow. They'll give in to the desire for wealth making. In the second generation, they'll throw off their children will throw off religion, and then they'll just make money. And then in the next generation, they'll add on to money making. They'll add on all sorts of other crazy things. I hate to say this, but I found a quote today by John Adams, in which he said he's in the 1820s and he's reflecting on the American and the French revolutions, and he basically says, in the end, the French Revolution is the natural consequence of the American Revolution. But I meant well. I had good intentions.
Are you reading a book about John Adams?
No, I'm reading his letters.
Oh, okay.
I'm just reading his letters. I was shocked when I read that, because Adams when he was 14 years old, Adams read a book by a Puritan revolutionary. It was basically justifying revolution. Because Adams descends from the Puritans, who are, of course, the first, or they're not the first, but they're another segment of the radical revolutionaries in the history of England. They are the first revolutionaries to cut off the head of the king in England. Right? Cromwell. And they're also the first revolutionaries to commit genocide in the modern world. In Ireland, yeah. These are the people we love. I mean, we're all trying to get Rhodes scholarships, right? So we can continue the glory of the British Empire. That's why Rhodes established the Rhodes Scholarship. He realized that the British Empire would wane in the 20th century. I mean, Cecil Rhodes is the founder of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. It was a British colony. And Rhodes wanted to continue the glory of the British Empire, and he realized that the British Empire would wane. He realized that the British Empire would wane in the 20th century, so that in order to prevent the empire from losing power, it would have to make all sorts of cultural and intellectual and political exchanges with the United States. And so he thought the way to do this would be to establish the Rhodes Scholarship. Because the Rhodes Scholarship would enable England to basically influence all the leaders of American culture. So they would basically influence American culture with British values. Right? So now every year we get all enthused and excited, and we fall over backwards to try to get our best undergraduates to go to England to be colonized once again by the British. Intellectually, though. And so he was a master sophist. If you think about it, I mean, the plan worked perfectly. And that's why England also, I think ultimately, this is why England supported the U.S. in the Second Iraq War. Because Tony Blair and his advisors, they realized for England to keep her predominance in the world, she wants to always separate herself a little from Europe and ride the coattails of the U.S., for better or for worse. England is to the U.S. what Corinth was to Athens. I think it's Corinth. Corinth sided with Sparta. So England is to the U.S. what... I have to think of it now. What's that other city near Athens? Basically, Athens was the empire. There's a bunch of small... Well, the Piraeus was a part of Athens. So it would be like... I forget the city now, but there was one city that Spartans laid siege to in the Peloponnesian War. It was a democracy, and it remained loyal to Athens. So the Spartans... It was Corinth?
Didn't Sparta talk to? There's a dialogue there with the rulers. Early on, right? Early on in the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Corinth. Yeah, Corinth defended Athens in the discussion.
I double fisted.
I think that's right.
You first.
I won't argue with you. The larger point is, what I'm trying to get at is that what happens in a lot of these, if you remember in Plato, the pursuit of the divine involves the moral life and the intellectual life. And what happens in a lot of the Protestant Revolution is you get a kind of mass. It's not a mass because they genuinely think they're following Christ. But in saying this is something can happen in anybody's spiritual life. You can say you're following Christ, but you're following Christ with your ideas, not his. Right? So you can follow Christ and at the same time make money. And that's the beginning of the separation from Christ. Philosophy, after this moral separation from Christ, philosophy oftentimes becomes a way of pursuing intellectual wisdom, not being open to the fullness of Christ. And so that's why this one guy who nobody likes in the U.S., but I like him, so not nobody. This one Thomist, this one feared Thomist from Italy, named Cornelio Fabro, Fabro. He wrote a book called God in Exile. And he shows how Descartes and his philosophy starts out with principles that basically lead us to modern atheism. Like over 400 or 500 years. So once you start to reject Christ, you're going to get on the road to atheism. You're on the road to rationalizing the atheist position. And that's why Heidegger, or all of these modern philosophers, to some degree, they'll say things that are brilliant and that are clever, and they're geniuses. But ultimately, they're working against Christ, right? And so it's fascinating that, for example, Heidegger, Edith Stein was a student of Husserl, and so was Heidegger. So you got Husserl, and then you got Stein and Heidegger are two students of Husserl. And Husserl was all into phenomenology. I told you the story, haven't I? Yeah, I told you. Right? Husserl is all into phenomenology, which we were exposed to in the Sophist. Right? And Edith Stein did the forbidden thing in modern philosophy, and she began reading Aquinas. Right? And then, because Husserl is all into all there are is appearances, and all we can do is understand the appearances. And he was well-intentioned. He said somehow, if we deal enough with the appearances, we might be able to make our way back to being. That was kind of his... Yeah. So Edith Stein does the forbidden thing, and she starts reading Aquinas. And then she goes to Husserl and Heidegger, and she says, hey, I'm reading Aquinas here. There might be something here. There might be some answers to all the questions you're dealing with. This might be the way to cut through the phenomena and get back to being. And Husserl said, I'm not interested in that. Right? And Heidegger basically said, I don't want to go there. I don't even know who started this rumor. I don't know where this rumor comes from. This is philosophical gossip now. But, right, someone said to me that Heidegger is probably one of the few philosophers in the history of philosophy who actually had an experience of being. But when he saw being, he rejected it. So, because Heidegger's whole project seems to be to develop metaphysics without reference to being. And so these 60s guys, like Thomas Merton, so basically when the Vatican Council comes around, there's all these people who basically say something like this. They say, they say, look, they say in almost every area of church life, they say everything before the Second Vatican Council was wrong. What we have to do is because modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes, they rejected Christ, and they developed a new philosophy, a new way of looking at the world, blah, 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 blah. So what we have to do now in the Second Vatican Council is we have to reject everything before the Second Vatican Council, and we have to engage this modern philosophy as if it were the only thing out there. And I'm exaggerating a little bit for emphasis, but not too much, actually. Well, no, because like there's this guy coming to campus in March, and he's basically a guy that, he'll point his finger out at Thomists and say, you Thomists are backwards, and you're inferior, and you have a less sophisticated culture, and you just have to admit it. Pardon? Yeah, because he's a hero. He's a hero of modern philosophy.
What's his name?
He, well, some of you have already seen him lecture.
Charles Taylor.
Yeah.
What's his name?
I'm reading one of his books.
Yeah.
Who?
Charles Taylor from what university?
McGill.
John, we're reading his book in morality.
Yeah, he's a typical guy you'd read.
Okay.
Who is Charles Taylor? He's a Catholic who divorced his wife to run away with his graduate student, and he's always, well, he did. He had his little honey up there as he was giving his lecture, excoriating the Catholics for being so rigid, right? But he's one of these guys who, whenever he's with the kind of atheists out there, he kind of acts a little bit like a Catholic. And then whenever he's with the Catholics, he kind of beats on them, saying, you guys are too Catholic. And so you could say, to be charitable to the guy, he's trying to bring together two schools that might never otherwise talk to each other. He kind of has one foot with the atheists and one foot with the Catholics. And he is trying to somehow bring them together. That's the best I can say. In the end, I don't know.
What's he coming for?
Because he's a hero.
What's the event?
He I think he's writing a book right now. Probably the real thing he's coming to do. The real thing he's coming to do is to remind everybody here to keep beating on the Thomists. No, it's true. That's what he'll remind everybody to do. And then the pretext for him coming here is that he's writing a book on the emergence of secularism, something like that. He's been writing this book for 5 years. The last time he was here, he Federal Expressed he FedExed his speech here from McGill, but there was a snowstorm in Montreal and a snowstorm in South Bend, so the speech didn't get here. So he had to wing it. But he could wing it because he gave the speech like 50 times already.
Why would you FedEx your speech?
Why don't you just bring it with you?
I have no idea.
Yeah, maybe he forgot it behind. It had one of his credits. He didn't ship it to him.
How big was it?
It's funny to speak when
Yeah, it's only like,
What we need him for? We have it here in person in paper.
it's like 20 pages long would be a typical speech. So anyway, I think you should go to Charles Taylor, but I might not go.
You don't be excoriated.
Huh?
Will they recognize you?
Yes.
Chicago fiasco.
I thought so.
Did you have an encounter with him? Yeah, he stood up.
Yes.
You can just guide yourself. Or
When he was in Chicago,
you can tell us what to say and we'll
I have witnesses.
You can be in the background with a microphone and you can tell us the questions to ask and we'll say nothing.
Wrong.
Totally silent.
I have witnesses. But anyway, when he was in Chicago giving the speech about how, and he kind of starts he starts wagging his finger at the Thomists. This is at Chicago too. There's no Thomists at the University of Chicago. And the funny thing about this whole event is that the Thomists don't even think that I'm a Thomist. Which makes the whole thing even more humorous.
What do they think you are?
I don't know what they think I am, but they don't invite me to their conferences. Right? So I don't know what I am. I'm confused. I don't know.
Well, I have that diagram of the sophist. We can break that out.
Yeah, we can try to figure out where I fit. No, but so he's wagging his finger. He's saying, "You Thomists out there, You just have to wake up to the fact that you're now a minority. Though I think historically Thomists have always been a minority. You're now a minority. You have a culture that is economically superior to yours. It's more sophisticated than yours. It's more advanced than yours. And you just have to wake up to that fact. So I was not trying to be a smartass. Okay? No, seriously. I have to say that. I think we're okay, yeah. I was not trying to be a smartass. And the thought occurred to me, well, what he's saying sounds a lot to me like the first Christians. Right? I mean, they're these little people. They have no schools. They get kicked out if it's found out that they're Christian, they get kicked out of the academy. And Rome had a superior military culture, a superior economic culture, because they adopted Greek culture. It was superior theatrically and everything. Rome was superior. And so, but the first Christians, in engaging Roman culture, the teenage girls basically were the leaders in this, basically saying, look, there's some things we're not going to do. Now, one little smart-ass thought entered into my mind, which was, but I got rid of it. I didn't put it as part of the question, which is basically, the Romans would not kiss the ass of the emperor, right? They would never, the Christians, the first Christians, sorry. The Christians would basically say, I'm not going to kiss the ass of the emperor. I'll do my job, I'll be a soldier, I'll go to the market, I'll be a tent maker, but I will not bow down and worship the emperor. And so they would rather not do that. They would rather die than do that. They drew a line. So, are there any questions? So I raised my hand, right? And I said, well, I'm just wondering, I said something to the effect of, if we're living in a culture that's superior to our own, the first Christians seemed to say that there were some things that they wouldn't do. They wouldn't worship the emperor. Could you speculate what kinds of things might exist in our culture that we wouldn't do, rather than Christians? Yeah, that we wouldn't do, even if it meant our death. And then he said, I'm not going to answer that question. That's a bad question. And then I had another little comment. I didn't say it, though. I thought there were no bad questions. Right? But I didn't say that. And then I said, well, but don't you think there'd be some lines that we would draw? And then he goes, that's the problem with people like you. You want to draw lines. You want to make distinctions. Actually, reading the speech of the Protagoras in the Theaetetus, I thought about that response of his. Because that's exactly what Protagoras says to Socrates. And then he goes on and he says, no one could ever tell when someone would become a martyr. No one could ever tell, what the circumstances might be or the conditions under which someone would accept martyrdom. So there is no way I could answer that question. And then something happened next, which never happens in academia, but it happened this time. The next question. Okay, so we've silenced the Thomist, right? Next question. Guy raises his hand. I just want to say, Professor Taylor, that the response you gave to the previous question was a beautiful answer. So he won't know my name, but he'll recognize me as that guy. I'm that guy now. I'm that guy.
We need to take another tour.
That was a good trip. That's true. Well, that conference takes place every year in March or April.
Really? That's right.
Like 5 of us stayed in Calumet.
I felt like
We went to Giordano's Pizza.
Yeah, that was awesome.
yeah.
But the parking was really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. How many blocks are there?
Did we go downtown to Giordano's?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I had Mike Bogdan get out and run across the street and stand in a parking space.
Yeah, right.
That's hot.
So anyway, I guess, is this the full answer? Have we answered your question?
About Thomas Merton? Yeah.
Yes. So,
That question got asked before I got here.
yeah, no, but basically
I wanted to be on Thomas Merton.
the point is though, is that I think many Catholic intellectuals, beginning in the 50s and 60s, they developed this real kind of inferiority complex with respect to Thomism. It's like any time the church recommends something, everybody has to run away from it. That's the basic point.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up question.
So basically that's why like everybody became enamored with Heidegger and Freud and Nietzsche and Marx in the 50s and 60s, because this was the new philosophy that we all need to kiss. It's you know what.
Okay, could you recommend like a couple 20th century writers like Jacques Maritain and who else?
Jack Maritain, Joseph Pieper, Pieper, Etienne Gilson,
I knew you were going to say
Gilson, Yves Simon, Simon. He's buried in the Notre Dame Cemetery. He taught at Notre Dame. Yves, Yves. And then another guy I'd recommend for political things, is James Hitchcock. He's very good. There's others I could recommend, but those are the big ones. Oh, and then the great Thomist of the early 20th century, we can never fail to mention him, because there's a town in Indiana which has his last name, Reginald Garrigou Lagrange. Garrigou, and then Lagrange. Lagrange, Indiana, baby.
Is that named?
Not after him, no. But actually, Garrigou Lagrange was the teacher of, among others, Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, Joseph Pieper, and Karol Wojtyla.
Isn't there a story about that? Where Garrigou Lagrange was like, wasn't he Karol Wojtyla's
Thesis director.
thesis advisor?
Huh? Yeah.
And then he was like, you need to change this because this isn't good. And then Karol Wojtyla said, no, screw you, and basically just left.
I don't think so.
Are you sure?
Well,
Not those words.
I'll
Yeah, he was disagreeing with Garrigou Lagrange. And so he decided not to get a degree at the Angelicum until he got an honorary degree as Pope, like 30 years later.
Of course.
Probably the disagreement was he was probably dealing too much with Scheller and phenomenology.
Yeah, it had something to do with phenomenology.
And Gary Lagrange said, for your dissertation, don't do it. Probably.
It was because of what's his face. What's his name?
But
Lubach.
I wouldn't make too much out of it. I
It
mean,
had something to do with.
I know, but I wouldn't make it out to be like like there was a fight. I would just there was
I've heard from several people that it was a pretty heated thing.
I don't think it was heated, because these guys are not. They don't get into. I mean, they may have disagreements, and the disagreements might lead them to separate, but it's not heated. That's what I would say.
It doesn't get emotional. It just gets.
It just gets where there comes to a point where they say, well, I'm going to follow a different path. And he says, well, I mean, I would say it was probably something. I think people tend to make it heated because they wanted to make it seem like there's a fight and a disagreement where one does not exist. I mean, where there might be intellectual disagreement, but it doesn't spill over into a faction. Because why? Because oftentimes they want to justify some faction that they're trying to create. I mean, it's like Paul and Barnabas disagreeing over Mark. Right? When Paul and Barnabas disagree over Mark, in the end, there is a disagreement, but they agree to basically everybody just goes their own way. We, looking back on it, we project our disorder, I think, into the disagreement, and we read more into it than was what was really there. Because why? Because especially we Americans, we like to slam people. We do. So we like to describe it as being X slamming Y or Y slamming Z, and when probably that's not really going on. It's true in the end that Maritain was critical of Garrigou-Lagrange for not speaking out, for example, against the Vichy regime in France. But it's something Maritain said kind of in a letter. But then it gets magnified by a scholar into this huge fight. Well, it wasn't a huge fight. It's like one time in one letter to an obscure SOB, Maritain, this was like in the 50s, right? Maritain said something about he wasn't sure if maybe the church would allow the pill as being the pill as being in harmony with the natural woman, the natural. I'm losing my capacity for language. The natural processes, right, of a woman, meaning it would be allowable. Well, because of that one line in a letter, a historian at Notre Dame has written a book in which he says Maritain challenged the teaching of the church on contraception. Well, you could look it up and confirm it. The author is McGreevy. Yeah. McGreevy, he's a history professor. Right, but so anybody can take something that was a small event with the people that were there and make more out of it than what really existed. So I would not read too much into these things.